It's now Category 1. Hurricane Lala is bearing down on Hawaii. It could be the first hurricane to make direct landfall on the Big Island in 155 years. As we started recording this segment, forecasters at the National Hurricane Centre were warning Lala is tracking very close to the southern tip of the Big Island. Airports and ports are closed, evacuation centres open. Residents report intense winds and heavy rain. Trees are being downed. There are thousands of power outages. Meteorologist Matthew Cappucci is tracking the storm for us. First of all, what makes this a Category 1 hurricane?
Yeah, good to see you. You know, when it comes to hurricane strength, we talk about it via the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale, which rates hurricanes based on wind speed. At the core of the storm is something called the eye wall, that innermost ring of winds. Now, that contains winds over 75 miles per hour, or 119 kilometers per hour. So Lala has reached that threshold based on Doppler radar. We see kind of a crisp eye beginning to form, and we know the winds are that strong. The piece of good news right now is that the center is still about 60 kilometers south of the southernmost tip of the Big Island. There have been sustained winds of 68 kilometers per hour so far in South Point, which is right at the southern end of that main island, with gusty around 101. So the winds aren't terrible, but the bigger impacts right now, the torrential rain, the surge, and even a low-end risk of an isolated tornado or waterspout.
What about the likelihood of it actually reaching the Big Island?
So that would be very interesting, because there has not been, as you mentioned, a direct hurricane landfall on record in Hawaii, which is rather strange to think about. Interestingly, the mountains, the high topography and the terrain of the Big Island are playing a role in two different ways. You know, number one, as the storm starts to approach, there's this kind of blowing of the winds over the mountain. And on the western side, in the lee of where those winds are blowing, that kind of absence of wind creates what we call a lee trough, or a broad, diffuse little zone of low pressure in the lee of the mountains. And that's almost sucking Lala northwards a little bit, pulling it closer to the island. So interestingly, the island might actually sort of be like pulling the storm closer. Conversely, however, those same high mountains are kind of shredding Lala's outer circulation. So yes, you might get the core to either come closer or reform, but you might weaken it a little bit. So a lot of complex mesoscale, localized meteorology at play here, and the global, more coarse weather models are having a tougher time picking up on that.
I find it interesting as well that it's slowly losing progression, or its forward speed. Is that dangerous in itself? I mean, could you see it suddenly slow down to the extent that it stays on the one area and just whacks that area with heaps of rain and wind?
Yeah, you're really spot on with the rain. That's my biggest concern for a couple of reasons. As you mentioned, Lala's forward speed is slowing down a little bit. And sometimes you even have hurricanes, especially when they're near mountains, kind of do these little weird loops called trochoidal wiggles or wobbles. And if it stalls, that would increase the rainfall risk, especially anytime you have mountainous terrain that basically pokes up into the very moist layers of the atmosphere and focuses all that moisture. It's like aiming a fire hose at a wall and all that water just rushing down the wall and pooling. That's what's happening. We're expecting widespread rainfall totals of 20 to 50 centimeters, locally more, and with the high terrain, flash flooding, mudslides, landslides, all a really big concern. At the coast, meanwhile, choppy waves. We might only see like a half meter to a meter of storm surge, so the rise of water levels. I'm not so much concerned about storm surge, but I'm very concerned about just the very high-end waves causing significant beach erosion. And for a state that depends so heavily on tourism and the beaches, this could be a significant impact economically.
And it's also carrying an immense moisture field. I was reading the applications of that.
Yeah, you know, hurricanes are very efficient rainfall producers because they are, for lack of a better term, a blob of tropical moisture. Ordinarily, when it rains, like a normal summertime thunderstorm, a piece of that raindrop evaporates on the way down because some of it is kind of eroded by drier air. Not in a hurricane. In a hurricane, every layer of atmosphere, bottom to top, is saturated, is wet. So you have bigger raindrops that are more huge and gloppy, so literally more water reaching the ground, but also it doesn't evaporate on the way down. So we call that highly efficient precipitation. And that's why we get rainfall rates sometimes of 7, 8, 9 centimeters per hour. And in situations like that, you can go from not much going on to significant flash flooding in 2, 3, 4 hours really quickly. So things will ramp up quite soon. And at this point, Lala is making its closest pass. My other concern too, sometimes as hurricanes pull away from an island, which will happen in the next 6 to 12 plus hours, you get these little kind of feeder bands that almost aim back at the island, like these zones of convergence gathering air that cause a continued fetch of moisture and heavy rainfall aiming at that beleaguered island. So the rains will continue well after the circulation starts to withdraw.
And Matthew, being an El Nino year, is that having some sort of bearing?
Absolutely. El Nino begins with a warming of water temperatures in the eastern tropical Pacific, and that induces rising air. You warm the waters, you warm the air above, that air wants to rise. And when you have rising air, you get more convection, thunderstorm activity, and more opportunity for tropical waves and tropical cyclones, i.e. storms and hurricanes. Now, conversely, in the Atlantic, air sinking, so a weaker hurricane season for the contiguous United States, but Hawaii, being the Pacific, is predisposed to a worse hurricane season. Now, interestingly, Hawaii, the Big Island, has never been hit directly by a hurricane before. And part of the reason is just honestly a very long period of good luck. But also, in the Central Pacific, where Hawaii is located, you generally have kind of stagnant high pressure, like this force field that tries to push away storms. You have slightly cooler water temperatures, and more often than not, you also have shear, disruptive changing winds with height. They kind of tear apart storms as they approach. Some of these factors are working against Lala. That's part of the reason why Lala is not a stronger storm. But given how close it is passing right now, within 50 or 60 kilometers of the Big Island, it goes to show you Hawaii has had good luck, but they are not invincible, and they do have to watch this very closely.
You were talking about those volcanic slopes drawing in the storm or the hurricane earlier. If the worst winds of that hurricane are lashing those slopes thousands of feet above sea level, what sort of destruction are we talking about there? You mentioned landslides, mudslides, and I also believe there are people living up in elevated areas off the grid in improvised housing.
Yeah, there certainly are. And the good news, if there is any, is that that part of Hawaii, the higher elevations, of course, are more sparsely populated. But those areas are more sort of attuned to high-end winds. Interestingly, for folks there up at elevation on some of these volcanic islands, they get their worst weather in the wintertime with what are called Kona storms, or these big sprawling low-pressure systems that tend to work in from the west, kind of the opposite wind direction, and they can cause all sorts of havoc. In fact, you oftentimes with those storms get a lot of snow in the highest summits of Hawaii. So high aloft and those high elevations, they are used to high-end wind. But when you factor in wind with heavy rains, it's a much different story.
And a lot more rain, because you'd get, what, 2 inches of rain an hour in some areas, which is 5 centimetres, I believe, but the higher elevations could see anything up to 25 inches, I believe.
Absolutely. I would not be surprised for a few totals to exceed that. And for all that to come down in just a day or two, you see why there are so many issues. We also briefly mentioned, and I think it'd be cool to discuss, the chance of an isolated waterspout or tornado. You know, hurricanes, tropical cyclones are big spinning systems, and there's an old expression in meteorology that big spin contains little spin. Big whirls have smaller whirls within them. Sometimes some of the thunderstorms or the convective cells, the individual clouds within those hurricane feeder bands or spiral downpour bands actually acquire a little bit of rotation because they feel the broader changing winds with height in the storm's overall wind field. And subsequently, those individual downpours within Lala are rotating a little bit. And there's a non-zero chance on the eastern side of the Big Island that 1 or 2 of those downpours could produce a brief waterspout offshore, or if it comes near shore, maybe a quick hitting tornado or two.
Matthew, just briefly on logistics. I mean, there are evacuations underway. Officials urge everyone in the warning zones to shelter in place immediately and avoid any unnecessary travel. Are people prepared for this? Because you mentioned these hurricanes are rare, despite it being such a tropical place. I know people are used to socking up, but are they used to battening down?
It's a really good point. We always tell folks when it comes to hurricanes, run from the water, hide from the wind. The vast majority of hurricane casualties stem not from direct wind impacts, but people who are hurt either by the surge, the rise in ocean water levels, or freshwater flooding more than anything else. And so I think given the surge itself is minimal, like the ocean's not coming up all that much, that's one piece of good news. But we always pray people don't underestimate the power of heavy rainfall and water. So that's why in situations like this, sheltering in place really is the best move, just staying off the roads. Whenever you have high-end freshwater flooding, the number one way that people wind up dying is because they try to drive through it. And so in this case, we really do urge everyone to stay off the roads. Of course, there is a state of emergency in effect that will allow the state government to access funds and do what they need to do more effectively and more quickly without sort of being tied down by bureaucracy. And so in this situation, as you said, stay off the roads, stay home, wait another 24 to 48 hours, and then go back to daily life.
Same thing, you don't want to drive through a bushfire, do you? And it sounds weird as we're talking about rain and flooding here, but there's even the possibility of wildfires kicking up with strong winds across the islands, I believe.
Yeah, we've seen that a couple times in the past, especially on the side of the island, the sort of least side of the island, that's not getting as much rain. There will be a little bit of drying. And after Lala pulls away, there will be sort of some continued winds, and that may be enough to, in some cases, afford some favorability for wildfire conditions. So we have to watch that pretty closely. We've seen that before with the Lahaina fires a few years ago. That was actually catalyzed by an offshore tropical cyclone that was far enough away to not bring rainfall, but was, close enough to induce some stronger winds and downsloping, dry air being pulled down the mountains. In this situation, I don't think the Big Island itself will be dealing with wildfire risk because they're just getting soaked right now. However, the islands farther north that are within the broader wind field, but out of the precipitation shield, may have to watch that. You're exactly correct.
Lastly, Matthew, a state of emergency has been declared. That'll mobilise disaster relief funds, of course, and activate the National Guard. But is there immediate help then that can be offered?
It is something we're watching. I think in this situation, the best help we can give is simply advice. The folks there, I think, are pretty well attuned to what's coming. I always liken a state of emergency to basically the government saying, officials, do what you need to do. We'll figure out almost how to pay for it later. We'll allocate the funds, or we'll make it speedier for you to access these resources. In this case, I think Hawaii is well versed, especially because, unfortunately, since 2018, they have had several high-end disasters, both from a flooding and a wildfire standpoint. This will likely be more flood impacts than anything else. So I think they are pretty well equipped to handle this.
And just one more thing I wanted to ask you. How predictable is a hurricane like this?
Hurricanes themselves, we can actually see sometimes 7 to 10 days in advance of their formation. So because they're sort of a broader weather system, they are easier to spot. However, one area of research that we're still trying to figure out is how to better predict the rate at which they intensify. We can sometimes say, hey, hurricane's going to rapidly intensify, but more often than not, hurricanes will just completely take off and strengthen so fast, outpacing even the most bullish, aggressive models. We found that hurricanes don't strengthen linearly, like they're not just steadily gaining steam. Most of their intensification comes in quick, frenetic spurts. And so if we can learn to better forecast that or better understand the predictive mechanisms behind that, we'll be able to program models better, which artificial intelligence is actually useful in, and hopefully be able to deliver slightly better strength forecasts, intensity forecasts down the road.
Matt, thanks for staying up late for us and for the people of Hawaii, of course.
Thank you.
If you're on Hawaii at the moment and can give us more details of what's going on, then let us know. I'm Ben Fazulin.